All right, I think we can start today. So welcome to our IIP talk dealing with the inauguration yesterday of the 46th President, Mr. Joe Biden. And the topic today of our discussion will be the future of United States of America and European Union cooperation. There are many different topics we want to discuss, but I also would like, of course, to welcome all our participants. And if you have questions or comments, please insert them below in the Q&A tool. And yes, I would say let's start. Yesterday, I think most of us, we were hearing the inauguration speech of Mr. Biden. And I would say that most European Union leaders, probably not all of them, but most European leaders, and especially in key countries, are actually quite happy about Biden's elections. Nevertheless, the speech he was delivering yesterday was a lot, of course, which was also expected on domestic issues first. And he also mentioned then that the strong alliance, that he wants to restore the alliance afterwards. The question still is the political system in the United States has becoming cracks, at least from many European Union countries. And the question is now, like, what is the future? I mean, do European leaders still think that we can rely on this? Or will we look more in the years to come, probably more to Berlin or Paris or to Washington? I would say maybe we start with HEINZ, if you want to give a short answer on leadership and on the future of the cooperation when it comes to Washington or Berlin or Paris.
Well, as European, I would say, as just as citizens of this world, one could be happy to have Biden and no longer Trump. But I think we should not expect that it will be a way back to what has been in the relationship between the EU and United States of America before Trump came into the presidency. Things have changed. And if I look to an opinion poll done by the European Council of Foreign Relations, it is shown quite clearly that there's a strong mistrust of Europeans. I say Europeans, not basically always of the elite or the politicians, but of citizens versus or even against the United States of America. The opinion poll was done before the storm on the Capitol, so it was even before this special event, there was a growing mistrust towards the leadership of the US, the functioning of the US. And therefore, I think we have to see things differently nowadays. The US lost a lot of credibility. Germany got a lot of new credibility, with all what that means we can discuss. But I just want to stop here and just make it clear that things will be different. The loss of credibility of the US is visible. Of course, we have also that the United Kingdom is no longer a member of the European Union. So even this will be not easy for Biden to combine his European policies on the one hand with United Kingdom of Boris Johnson and the EU on the other side. So just as a first brief input to answer to your question.
Since I was not naming you, I just totally forgot this Hannes SWOBODA. He used to be a member of the European Parliament and chair of the S&D group there, and he's also the president of the International Institute for Peace. You mentioned the loss of credibility and probably also what the European Union feels and many European Union states, that also it's a mistrust towards Washington, also when it comes to reliability. HEINZ GÄRTNER, he is a professor at the University of Vienna and also the chair of the advisory board of the IIP. I would also like to welcome you. And maybe just very shortly, how do you see the future of leadership? Would you think that the United States will become again this preeminent global leader, which it used to be? I mean, sometimes more or less, but it definitely did in the last years after the Cold War.
Thank you, Stephanie, for moderating it. And I want to also thank the International Institute for Peace to set up this panel so quickly after the inauguration speech. Basically, what we are witnessing now is two foreign policy models. The one is, which we are familiar with already, is this America First, which is not an invention by Donald Trump. So it was already, the origins go back to the interwar period. But as we know it, it's a justification for sanctions, for threat, for denigrating international institutions, building walls, etc. Then now we have this new model, which is also American model, but it's not that new either. But Joseph Biden mentioned also in several speeches, I guess he mentioned it yesterday as well, is leadership by example. Leadership by example, which is a Jeffersonian model, and Ronald Reagan picked it up with the same idea, the shining city upon the hill. Still it's leadership. So still it's leadership, and it's not necessarily partnership. So it means less sanctions, but more diplomatic pressure, more international organizations, less unilateral tariffs in economic issues. So leadership, if the Europeans want to deal with the new Biden administration, it has to act itself. So it should welcome Biden, but not wait for him. It should act in order to be respected. So what we witnessed the last 4 years, that in the major political crisis situation all over the world, the Europeans were bystanders. So it was in the Middle East, so they relied what Trump was doing with this Kushner plan, which is basically doing away with the two-state solution. Now Biden said he might pick it up again. Settlements are going on in the West Bank, so I didn't hear any European voice saying something about it yet. So then we have North Korea. It was a bilateral game between Kim and Trump. The European interests at stake as well, because North Korean missiles could reach Europe as well. So one idea would be that the European Union gets involved in 6-7 party talks, as we had it before. Arms control issues, there was no voice, European voice against abandoning the INF Treaty, even so missiles can be deployed in Europe. So now we probably the START Treaty will be extended, but the Europeans should have a voice what the future of arms control is about. And when it comes to the JCPOA, the Europeans didn't say very much. So they kept the JCPOA alive, that's true, but they were threatened by secondary sanctions and basically stopped trade and investment in Iran. And now they're still threatened with secondary sanctions. So the first thing that the European Union should tell Biden, please do away with the secondary sanctions, then we can talk about the JCPOA. I didn't hear much about this. So my argument would be the Europeans have to raise their voice in order not to become a subordinate role in the Biden administration as it was in the Trump administration. Yeah, I stop here.
Thank you very much, Heinz. I mean, you mentioned that what Biden was yesterday saying, that he wants to lead by power of example, not the other way around, and that he also wants to restore old alliances. This is what he was saying. But if we look now at the developments in the European Union, of course, they were a consequence of the Trump administration as well. But we speak a lot, like especially in the last 2 years, about the so-called strategic autonomy or the need for a sovereign Europe. And we all remember also when Merkel was saying that we cannot count on our allies unconditionally anymore. So the question would be, like, what future would you actually see? Hannes, maybe you can start for the transatlantic alliance. Like, what will it be based on? Will it be common values? Will it be interests? Or is Europe striving for a more sovereign Europe? I mean, we all know that Europe still is the largest economy in the world. So how do you see the future of transatlantic relations in this context?
I think any president of the United States of America will speak about leadership. I agree with Heinz. It's in a way it's nonsense because it is let's say a fantasy or a vision, or let's say maybe a fantasy. You could also say with Trump it's a fake news, but they will never deny it. And of course, military, they are very strong and they are united, even if they are split inside. But for every time, every moment, there's one president who speaks and who tries to define the policies. Europe is different. Europe is consisting of many nation states and many different interests, and it's a combination of different nation states. And even if the United Kingdom now left, which could bring more unity amidst the rest of it, but we are already split with, on the one hand, the United Kingdom, part of NATO, part of Europe in a wider sense. So this is, I think, one of the elements we have to recognize with all the weaknesses. Most of them I would agree with HEINZ, but maybe on the other hand, you have to see, for example, Middle East. And I know it quite well from many years and being engaged in the Middle East. They always said, okay, fine, you are here, but we need the US. Israel, of course, said it quite clearly, because for Israel, only the US was an ally. Europe was always too critical, and they always said, well, when you did the Holocaust, you have not anything to say to us. And even the Arabs, the Palestinians said, well, we need the US. It's good that you are on our side, but we need the US. But coming away from now back to Europe, again, the opinion poll I mentioned before shows that more and more citizens think we have to have a different kind of policy and attitude. It's interesting that the authors tried to define 4 different tribes in Europe. The one is America we trust. This is the smallest part now. The second one is we trust in the West, second smallest one. Then in decline we trust. That means the people who think anyway the West is declining, we have to recognize. But the biggest tribe for the moment is in Europe we trust, which is quite interesting. Of course, it's different in Poland and in Hungary. There are more sympathies for the United States, but even there it is much lower the attitude, although much weaker the attitude towards the United States of America. Now, this is an opinion poll made, in I think about 14 countries. Austria was not included. So it's West and East and North and South, and there are differences. But at least if European politicians, and here I come back to what HEINZ said, if European politicians would take this change in the attitude of the citizen, then they could build a stronger European position. Sometimes, the people, many people would say very often the people are more progressive and more forward-looking than the politicians. And this could be also the case here, that the citizens of Europe recognize that we have to have to go a different way. We have to have more European position, clearer European position than the politicians still have. Of course, we can discuss other issues later, especially on defense. How can we organize that? But again, I think this kind of having a very strong attitude of people, of citizens, or let's say a growing attitude of people under the heading "In Europe we trust," that should be transformed into policies. And that is, of course, the task of European politicians. And the last sentence, if I read now somewhere that the President of the European Council, Michel, proposed to Biden a new, basic treaty to reformulate the transatlantic relationship. I think first we have to define European interests in that relationship, and then we can speak about a new common strategy on some issues. But I think it is much more important to have our opinion and our strategy on China, our strategy on Russia, and so on.
HEINZ, I would also, of course, also give the same question to you about the future of transatlantic relations, and also in context of what Hannes was mentioning, that also this public opinion polls seem also to go into this direction, that Europe also needs to be sovereign in a way. This doesn't exclude, of course, cooperation with the United States. But what would you say, does this mean for the future of NATO, for example? I mean, we also, when we talk about Article 5, like how strong is Article 5 still? I mean, this is also a discussion which has been dealt with in recent years. So what future for security and transatlantic relations from Europe?
Very good questions. Thank you, Stephanie. First of all, I want to underline and support 100% what Hannes said. Europe has to get its act together and find its own position. So Europe, only that way Europe can get some leverage in this international crisis. You're definitely right, Hannes. So everybody's looking at the US, but you have to find the reasons why that's the case, because Europe is not seen as a strong partner yet. So we have to become a political and economic power. So I'm not against European common defense policy. We need it for missions. But the answer to increase military budgets, because you mentioned defense, will not solve the problem. So that will not help us to get political leverage in all this crisis. Then we'll come back to your question, Stephanie, about NATO and transatlantic relations. Here I see it a little bit skeptical what the Biden administration intends to do, because when they talk about multilateralism, immediately they say we have to work together with our allies and partners. That means basically for Europe, NATO states, and internationally it means South Korea, Japan, Australia, maybe New Zealand. So that's a very selective multilateralism. So it's very focused on allies and maybe reliable partners. But multilateralism, as we know it in international organizations, for example, the United Nations, is inclusive. And Biden was also speaking of an alliance of democracies. So how do we define democracy? So that's very difficult to do, and that would be very exclusive, and it would really run against the understanding of multilateralism what we have. So maybe that's not it will be not that implemented as he said it, because Biden is returning to the Paris Climate Accord, which of course includes other states as well, especially China, and to the World Health Organization, which is a multilateral organization. But an exclusive multilateralism focusing only on NATO maybe is too narrow. And of course, all this debate about Article 5, we are sitting in a neutral state, is not basically so much what neutral states are concerned about. Basically, we have to be concerned about what NATO is, how it is defining now, Article 5, because it includes cyber as well. And it's hard to attribute an enemy or an attacker in the cyberspace. But when NATO says we have to invoke Article 5, that means with military means you have to come to the aid to a country which is supposed target of an hacker attack. So it's a very, very dangerous situation. So I do see the Article 5 situation also very, very skeptical. And now we are moving towards including, which is not happening, but including Article 5 for China's threat. So it's not happening now, but we are hearing statements in this direction as well. So transatlantic relations have to be much stronger, and as we both said, Hannes and I, Europe has to, in order to respect it, to get their own positions formulated, and then work on equal footing with the Biden administration.
Thank you very much, Heinz. Since you mentioned very interestingly selective multilateralism and also China, and I think this is also something we should talk a little bit about, since China will be the biggest focus, probably not only focus of the US, but of course also of the European Union, since it is an emerging power. It is militarily, it's economically. But the question, what I would like to pose is now, what can and will the European Union do? Because will it stick? I mean, does it try to stand neutral between, this probably even going back a little bit to a bipolar world between like the West against China? Or will it also try to be neutral with this, just to have like, to work with China where we share the same interests? You also mentioned the climate accords. I mean, there are international problems which we can only solve internationally. So what China policy should the European Union have, and what will it have? Maybe Hannes, you start. Please unmute.
Because sometimes I'm still coughing, so I was muting myself. Now, the China policy, of course, must be different from that of the US. For the US, China is an economic competitor, but also military, security-wise. This is not the case for Europe. We are not engaged in the South China Sea or in the Pacific. And that's, of course, the difference. The US is a Pacific country. And if you look to the history, not only Pearl Harbor, but before, the US was very much engaged in the Pacific, while some of the European countries maybe, unfortunately, and at that time, I must even say that the US was more progressive in the time when European powers, especially the British, were occupying China, or Japan was occupying China, part of China. The US was critical. Of course, they wanted to have an open access to China, but at least this gave some progressive voices. It became lately very bad, the relationship, and of course, especially Trump, who didn't know how to deal with it in a rational way. European Union has to go differently. I deplore very much all those people who say, well, let's not criticize China for human rights violation and whatever. Interesting enough, many Muslim countries don't criticize China on what they do with the Uyghurs, with the Muslim population in the west of China. But on the other hand, I think we need China for many, many issues, not only economic issues and for trade relationship, but also climate change is a very important subject. So it would be nonsense to push China back generally, but define clear where we want to cooperate with China, where there is a competition and where there is even some contradiction between Chinese policies and our policies. With the more or less agreed investment strategy and the investment agreement between China and European Union, I remember when I was still in the European Parliament, we discussed it. I think that's an important step forward. And it was not by chance that the basic agreement has been found already before Biden was inaugurated. It was also during the German presidency. And that was, for me, a clear signal of the European Union to say, look, we do that and you cannot prevent it. Biden and all his team is already critical about it. I hope that the European Union will stick to it because it is not acceptable for European Union that the US is defining our China policy. We can agree on some of the elements where we have an agreement, but first, again, as we said before, it is us, Europeans, to define what kind of strategy that means. And that does not mean open access for China for all our companies, for all our knowledge and research and so on, but it does mean mutual understanding, agreement, reciprocity. When we open our markets, they have to open our markets. And I think that's very important. China is, and also the European poll shows that our citizens in Europe recognize that China will be the big power and will be even bigger than the US. And it would be nonsense to deny it, not that we should be subservient and do everything China. No kowtow is needed, not at all. But a reasonable relationship with China is our interest, and we can repeat Trump to say European interest first on these issues.
Thank you very much, Hannes. Heinz, since Hannes now gave a very good, I would say, European reflection on this issue, like what would you say, how would the US see this if Europe says we want to find our own way and you cannot define our China policy? Do you think that, I mean, with Trump, I would say it would have been quite clear that he would probably have tried to threaten us to go with him. But what is your opinion? I mean, it's a speculative question and very provocative. But what do you think? How would the Biden administration react on this in the next?
First of all, I support what HEINZ said. If you look at the European Union global strategy, it states the European Union has to have a engagement policy with China. So it's basically what HEINZ described what it is. Yeah, if you look at the Biden administration, we go back to this leadership role. So there will be pressure on Europe by the Biden administration on Europe. So they will say now we talk to you about China. We don't ignore you as the Trump administration, but eventually you have to support our China policy. So that will be what will happen. So if Europe doesn't have its own China policy, it might be entangled in some great power conflict. So and this conflict is more structural. So it does not really depend so much on the person who is sitting in the White House. So great power conflicts, it goes back in history for many years. And you, Stephanie, mentioned yourself a new bipolarity. Maybe the question is how we deal with it. So, and if you look at some academics, how they see the debate, US-China relations, so we have in a spectrum, two sides. And one side says we can have a situation like the beginning of the 19th century with the Concert of Vienna, big power cooperation, which might bring peace. The other side of the spectrum says there is this Thucydides trap that great powers with high likelihood eventually might be entangled in a great power war. So like Graham Allison. So that would be the end of the 19th century. So where we move towards more conflict, that multilateralism will be abandoned. So we do have these two scenarios. So Europe has to find its own position in this great power conflict. So it cannot have the same position as Europe, especially when it comes to the scenario of the end of the 19th century. So if there is a military conflict between China and the US, Europe has to decide what to do. It will not side with China, probably not. But to be entangled on the side of the US in a military conflict is not good for the Europeans as well. So maybe in that case, especially Europe has to stay, should have to stay neutral. So Austria has already the position that they can easily say we are not part of this conflict, but the European Union has to think about it. If this worst case scenario would happen. Of course, there are conflicts, and HEINZ pointed them out in trade relations, also in maybe human rights relations, whatever, so that they have to be addressed, but they have to be seen differently from this great power conflict.
Thank you very much. Maybe from my side, one last question. Since Trump left, but I think it is also quite clear that Trumpism didn't leave. So it's still like the society, the people in the United States are very, very much, I would say, divided, and it's a quite a polarized world these days. So in general, the question is, I mean, also if you look at Biden's past, since he was always quite, I would say, outspoken when it comes to foreign policy, he was responsible for foreign policy before he became vice president. So will foreign policy at all play a role in the US in the, let's say, like in the first 1.5 years, or will he really focus more on the problems within the United States and not really fulfill the hopes we are having in him? Also, when it comes to the Western Balkans, I know from many friends that they have many hopes that the US will give new incentives in this area. The Middle East, you mentioned it, Israel, Palestine, but also, yes, what would be your stance on that question, foreign policy in general?
Well, I think that Biden has recognized, and not only him, that Europe can, the US can only be strong also international and in foreign policy if it is not as divided as is now. And if Biden all the time has to, to fight against these guys who were occupying the capital, and the race relationship is still open, of course it will not be. He will not be able to solve it immediately. If you look, for example, to the race relation, how many years racial discrimination, especially by the police, was going on, and even during the Obama time, where he tried to be soft because he was black and not ordered to take part. And even now, recently, I think when there was a black guy killed in the back, the police was acquitted and said, no, there's no reason to bring him to court. So I think this will not stop. The US is weakened, and it's not possible in few days or months or even years to change that dramatically. And Trump will be, the elephant in the room all the time, and he will destroy a lot of porcelain by trumping around. So I think that will be a big difficulty. The difference, of course, will be that I think that the Biden administration and the foreign ministers and so on will be not as selective as it was. And here Europe should have already reacted towards this selective policy, where Mr. Pompeo tried to, to speak with some of the friends. Unfortunately, also the Austrian foreign minister and chancellor, who tried to be very close to Trump. I don't know what they wanted to gain. They could have seen that Trump would probably lose, and is a crazy guy. So this was an ugly element, I think, of Austrian foreign policy. And hope that the EU and other countries will say, if you want to speak with us, you speak to all of us. Of course, you can visit different countries, but not, looking to your friends only. And that will be different. But again, I think US will be weaker than before because of that situation, which didn't come all of a sudden by Trump. Let's see about the Tea Party. The Tea Party already started this fight on the right many years ago, and was followed by this Trumpism. And maybe the Republicans will split, I don't know, but there will be enough people who think, if I want to have a strong position, I still have to rely on these crazy guys. White supremacy will not disappear. So this is another chance for Europe to say, of course, we have a partner in the US, but the partner is weakened, and therefore we have to be stronger. Because to deal with Putin or Xi Jinping, you have to be strong. Strong, but not crazy. And that, I think, is what is the difference to Trump. Trump was finally not strong, but crazy. And that must be a difference. And this is a new possibility, a new chance for the European Union.
Thank you very much, Hannes. And at this point, I would also like to invite our participants again. If they have a question, please just write it in the Q&A form below. But I also would like to give the same question to HEINZ, because I know we have actually been talking about this yesterday on the telephone. So HEINZ, what would you say?
What now Hannes was saying, it demonstrates that the problem with leading by example. So the US is not the shining city upon the hill when it comes neither foreign policy nor domestic policy. So if you, the Europeans closed their eyes in history all the time. So because to save the transatlantic relations. So of course, Europeans trusted the Americans because it intervened in 2 world wars and was the leading power against the Warsaw Pact, the communists. It was helped Europeans with the Marshall Plan, but the Europeans closed their eyes when it came to the Vietnam War and around 80 interventions for regime change, and the Democrats did not hold back in that situation. The Democrats supported basically all the foreign interventions. So it was not that easy anymore during the Iraq War 2003. And during the Trump administration, it became obvious that this trust crumbled between Europeans and not all Europeans, but and the US. But the same is true for domestic policy. So what we see is a multiple crisis in the US. So it's not only the economic crisis, the health crisis, crisis of the justice system, as what Hannes was talking about. A cultural war is going on, but also a crisis of the political system. Of course, now Biden is elected, but it was very difficult for American democracy. So in the first place, if you're a model for democracy, you avoid to getting in this situation the US was. Now they're saying, now we got out as a democracy. That's true. But how did you get in? So there must be some structural problems here. So the soft power, what Joseph Nye is always stressing, is very selective. So it's selective to the working things, but it's not looking at the social crisis and the health crisis and only on the elite universities and the popular culture of the US and the high technology. So in that sense, maybe US can be a model, but not as a model, as a society as a whole. So the Europeans have to recognize, and the Americans themselves have to recognize they're not a shining city upon the hills, but a normal state and a normal power. And the Europeans have to act and deal with the United States. It's a big power, of course, but on equal footing and mutual respect. So the leadership question is problematic, and also leading by example is more euphemism than a reality.
Thank you very much, Heinz. Let's go to the questions now. I see the first one from Andreas Stadler. Nice seeing you here. I hope you're doing well. The question is, the European Union, yes, it needs to get its act together, but what about deepening European Union CSDP, so Common Security and Defense Policy? And also the question on your opinion on the European Peace Facility, which is as far as I'm aware, a fund intended to fund peace and strengthen international security. CSDP, who would like to start?
Well, very short, maybe I can come in on the second question on the Balkans then. Let me briefly say, of course, we are Institute for Peace and we are interested in peace. I think what we need in general is a new initiative on peace policies. Peace for some time has been some sort of a four-letter word, not used very much and very easily by many people. It was more about defense, about war. But if you look to the Middle East, if you look to North Africa, to Africa, I just wrote a blog on Congo, where there's a war since decades continuing, and there is no real effort going into a peace policy. And of course, the big issue of China, South China Sea and so on. I think peace is something which should be much higher on the agenda. Not that defense is not possible, not necessary, and cyber attacks, of course, are here, and we have to do something against it because they can destroy a lot of things. But there should be a new initiative towards peace, and whatever can be done should be done in that direction, and to go away from this avoiding to speak about peace. If you look how many conflicts we still have, or for example, Yemen. Look what Pompeo and the US did. It was a horrible step in saying the Houthis are terrorists and therefore we cannot even help them with humanitarian aid. Also, this has to be undone by the Biden regime. So again, and Cuba, again, what they did recently. So even in the last days, these really awful foreign minister, state secretary Pompeo did a lot of destructive issues. He was, I think, one of the most destructive foreign policies, even if they didn't start a war. They did everything to promote war when it was there and to fight against citizens' rights. And therefore, I hope that the Biden administration is also thinking more of peace. And I hope that the European Union will tell also Biden, if you want to stop the war in Yemen, if you want to stop the killings and the hunger and the deaths of many people in Yemen, you have to undo what the Trump administration did in the last days.
Thank you, Hannes. Heinz, would you like to add something on CSDP or?
No, I just want to say the CSDP has become a very cumbersome process. It was too much of an internal debate in the European Union, and so they missed to look at the outside. What's happening outside of the European Union. So the EU Global Strategy was a very good document, and it looked at the borders beyond the European Union. CSDP is always a process looking inside what is happening inside. So the global strategy has to implement it, and also the phrase strategic autonomy has to be filled with content. So it's very vague. We do it ourselves, but not against the United States, which is all true, but it's not filled with substance yet. So the CSDP is fine, but it doesn't solve the transatlantic relations at all. But let me add one thing when Hannes was talking about peace. There's one document in European history which is remarkable, and it was very little referred to, and it was adopted at the height of the Cold War, 1975. It was the Helsinki Final Act. So if you read the Helsinki Final Act, as I said, bipolarity, height of the Cold War. So there's no single word about enemy, foe, rival, not even competitor. If you look at the current military security strategy all over the world, they are full of these attributes. Not a single word in the final Helsinki Act, but lots of cooperation. Security is indivisible. In our times, we have to add security and health is indivisible. Borders can be changed only on a multilateral basis. So if you speak to NATO officials, they say the best thing what we can do is to go back to the Hamel Plan 67, which means strong deterrence and from a position of strength, starting a dialogue. So basically, I guess we are not even there yet, but 75 should be the goal. So if the European Union and the global strategy would look at this document, and it was successful, actually, it contributed also to the demise of the Warsaw Pact as well. It strengthened civil society, the Charter 77 in Czechoslovakia. So it was a very good document, and it was not based on polarization, so the attempt to overcome polarization. So in this world today, and it was included, of course, Europe, US, and Canada and Soviet Union. So it was we should look at, if we talk about models, that would be the model to look at.
Thank you very much, Heinz. Another question, and I will start with Hannes. It's about the Western Balkans. And someone is asking, and I was mentioning it already before, that the expectations of the Western Balkan 6 are very high on the new United States administration. President Biden has shown great interest in the past. He traveled there several times, already in the 70s, what I read today. The question is now, do you believe that this interest will remain also in the agenda during his presidency? Hannes, what do you think, Western Balkans?
Well, I think that we had recently a discussion, and somebody said in the Western Balkans, everybody is looking to the US, what they do, what they say. but it doesn't have any effect because there is not much activity coming from. And activity which is coming or was coming from recently, for example, in Kosovo, was a destruction of the Kurdi government. And then the court, the Constitutional Court said it was illegal, and now they have to have new election. Again, everything which Pompeo and it was Mr. Grenell, touched is now, is in dust. And I think, yes, it would be good, and it would be good to return to a cooperation because it's our backyard. It's not a good expression because it's our neighborhood, it's our future part of the European Union, and we have to do it together. We have Mr. Lajčák now, who is a very good and able man to speak and to negotiate with the countries, and there's a lot of other things to do. Yes, it will be good. Biden and some of his people will be interested, but I think this is one form where there should be a close cooperation. Again, if we speak about leadership, with the lead of Europeans, because it's about Europe. But it would be good if the US would help with investment, with many other things. And I think that could be the future.
Thank you, Hannes. Yeah, there might be a chance to go back to US, European Union, dealing together on what can be done best for the Western Balkans. I have another question. I would like to address that to you, Heinz, because that is, I know your sphere of work as well. The question is that in light of the new United States administration and referring to the need for the European Union to consolidate its position, what does that mean for the European Union's nuclear non-proliferation, arms control and disarmament policy? Does that mean that the European Union will have to make a choice between multilateralism as a value and multilateralism as an interest? Or, in other words, can the European Union actually pull through with strategic autonomy in nuclear matters and engage more actively in this area? Or will it stay in the background again and hope for the best from the new United States administration? And just let me add very shortly that tomorrow, we talked about it yesterday, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons will enter into force. So this question is quite timely, I would say, in this context. So Heinz, please.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that the PAN Treaty is now going to be implemented. At least it is becoming legal, and the nuclear weapons are becoming illegal with this treaty, and it's a multilateral treaty. On the other hand, of course, we saw a demolition and the demise of the boundaries of arms control, and a case in point, of course, is the INF Treaty and the Treaty of the abandonment of intermediate range territorial-based nuclear ballistic missiles. It was a bilateral treaty between the Soviet Union and the US. And many would say, and that's basically an excuse, because we were talking about multilateralism, but it's an excuse, and Europeans would in many ways say, oh, no, we don't have a say in this because it's a thing between the US and Russia now, and which is not true, because if I look back to the situation in the 80s, before this treaty was concluded, first of all, the Europeans had an influence that these missiles would be deployed in Europe, because Helmut Schmidt, Chancellor of Germany, said, oh, the Russians are developing this SS-20, we have to have a counterbalance. And the Americans said, okay, yes, we have the Pershing and the cruise missiles. And then there was a wake-up call in Europe, all over, peace movement, politicians, they say, oh, when it comes to this situation, Europe might be a theater of a nuclear war. Big powers deploy their missiles in Europe and fight the nuclear war in Europe and not being effective. So, and this led to this INF Treaty in 87. So the Europeans had a huge influence to get rid of this INF Treaty. Now I have to say the Europeans were very, very silent when it came to the abandoning of. We have the same situation as it was in the 80s. So there's no difference. The deployment is not immediate yet, but probably it is. We don't really know. So it's already sea-based developing technology, anti-missile anti-missile facilities. So they all can be used for this already. So Europeans should have a say, and they should have a say. But when it comes to the START treaty, strategic nuclear weapons can be used also in the European territory. Of course, there are others treaty which are more multilateral, and I guess the Biden administration will return also to the Open Skies treaty, which has been abandoned by Trump. So I do think that's an excuse to say, no, that's only a thing of the US and Russia. And the ban treaty is a case in point that the non-nuclear weapon states have a say. Unfortunately, I have to say Europe is the continent where percentage-wise we have the lowest number of countries which joined the treaty. The reason is, of course, NATO membership, because no NATO member supported or joined the treaty, and NATO even declared that this treaty would not have an effect on international law and would not contribute to this disarmament. It's the NATO position now. So Europeans can have a voice, and civil society can have a voice and should have a voice. And there is no excuse whether it's multilateral or bilateral.
Thank you very much, Heinz. And I think, if Hannes, if you don't want to add something, I think we can close. We try to discuss many issues dealing on multilateralism and what future for the United States and European Union cooperation, with a question mark, of course. But I can say there's lots to do, and European Union will try also to be at least a little bit neutral when it comes to Russia-China policy, to find its way how to deal with the United States as an ally when we share the same interests and values, but sometimes also when it is in our interest when it comes to international obligation, be it climate, be it cyber, be it regulation of digital platforms, but also economics and trade, that we also need to find cooperation. So it's probably what, as Heinz, as you mentioned, it is selective multilateral approach. Let me thank you for your time, for your being here, and a nice day. And we will keep discussing these issues in the year to come, I'm pretty sure. And have a nice day. And thanks everyone for participating. And stay healthy and stay safe. Goodbye.
Bye bye.